It begins like a whisper carried across the Danube, a quiet murmur that slowly grows into the sound of marching boots, shifting borders, and anxious governments waiting for the next tremor in a restless Europe. By the late 1930s, the Balkans were not merely a region on the map, they were a tense crossroads of ambition, fear, and unresolved wounds left open after the First World War. Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, three nations bound by geography but divided by history, found themselves caught between powerful empires and the dangerous promises of rising dictators. The storm of World War II had not yet reached them, but its clouds had already cast a long shadow. For Hungary, the interwar years felt like living in the echo of a national tragedy. The Treaty of Trianon in 1920 had reduced the once expansive kingdom to a fraction of its former size. Millions of ethnic Hungarians were stranded beyond new borders drawn with little regard for cultural or historical ties. The bitterness of loss ran deep. Every school child learned the old map of their country, a ghost of what once was, and politicians repeatedly vowed to restore those lands. Budapest streets were filled with murals, songs, and slogans demanding justice for Trianon. Hungary did not simply want change, it wanted revenge against the treaties that had diminished it. And in the 1930s, the nation slowly turned its eyes toward the only power in Europe that seemed willing to promise territorial revision, Adolf Hitler's Germany. Romania, meanwhile, stood in an uneasy position of having gained more than it expected after World War I. The region of Transylvania, taken from Hungary, became part of Greater Romania. But this larger Romania was fragile. Its population was ethnically diverse, its borders contested, and its political system unstable. Soon, economic hardship and rising extremist groups like the Iron Guard pushed the country toward authoritarianism. Even worse, the looming presence of the Soviet Union haunted Romanian leadership. In 1940, the USSR seized Bessarabia and northern Bukovina, humiliating Romania and exposing its vulnerability. In desperation, the Romanian government looked to Germany for protection, believing that Hitler was the only force strong enough to shield them from further Soviet aggression. Bulgaria's frustrations were no less intense. The Treaty of Neuilly had stripped it of land after World War I, leaving behind a nation humiliated and bitter. Western Thrace, a vital route to the Aegean Sea, was taken away, cutting Bulgaria off from the waters it once controlled. Bulgaria felt cheated by the Western allies and believed that the international system was rigged against it. This resentment created a natural political opening for Nazi Germany, which courted Bulgaria with promises of restored territories in Macedonia and Thrace if it aligned itself with the Axis powers. Unlike Hungary and Romania, Bulgaria's decision was influenced less by fear of the Soviet Union and more by the dream of recovering what was lost. As the 1930s progressed, Europe's fragile peace began to unravel. Germany rearmed in defiance of the Versailles Treaty, reoccupied the Rhineland, absorbed Austria, and then moved against Czechoslovakia. Each move was bold, illegal, and successful. Smaller nations observed these events with growing unease. Germany was becoming unstoppable, and diplomacy alone seemed powerless. At the same time, Italy under Mussolini pursued its own expansion, while Japan advanced through East Asia. The world was dividing itself into two camps, and neutrality was becoming difficult for any nation, especially for those in the Balkans, where borders had long been temporary lines drawn across ancient disputes. Germany understood that the road to domination in Europe ran through the Balkans. The region offered crucial oil, food, and strategic positions for any future assault on the Soviet Union. Hitler also knew that Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria were full of grievances that could be easily manipulated. Through a mixture of economic agreements, military pressure, and diplomatic charm, Germany gradually pulled the Balkan states into its orbit. German goods flooded their markets, German officers visited their armies, and German promises filled their political speeches. Slowly but surely, the three nations shifted from cautious neutrality to quiet cooperation with the Axis. By 1939, as Germany invaded Poland and World War II officially began, the Balkans held their breath. None of the three nations wanted to be dragged directly into the fighting, but all were watching closely. When Germany defeated France in just 6 weeks in 1940, the balance of power in Europe changed forever. The Western Allies, once seen as protectors, now appeared weak and distant. Britain was still fighting, but it was alone. Germany's victory convinced many Balkan leaders that resisting Hitler was pointless and aligning with him was not only beneficial, it was necessary for survival. Under increasing pressure, and tempted by promises of territorial gains, Hungary joined the Axis first. Germany rewarded it with parts of Czechoslovak and Romanian territory, strengthening Hungarian dependence on Berlin. For Budapest, it was a dream coming true. Lands lost after World War I were now being regained without firing a shot. But this dream came at a price. Hungary was now tied to Hitler's ambitions. Romania's shift was more dramatic. After losing territory to the USSR, Hungary, and Bulgaria in a matter of months in 1940, Romania was on the verge of collapse. King Carol II was forced to abdicate, and a new, German-friendly regime under General Ion Antonescu came to power. Romania joined the Axis not out of ambition but out of fear of being swallowed by the Soviets, fear of internal chaos, and fear of Germany turning against them if they stayed neutral. Bulgaria waited longer, balancing between Germany and the Soviet Union. The Bulgarian government admired German strength but was reluctant to join any anti-Soviet alliance. Yet when Germany prepared to invade Greece and Yugoslavia, it needed Bulgaria's cooperation for troop movement. In early 1941, Bulgaria agreed and joined the Axis, soon receiving parts of Thrace and Macedonia as rewards. Thus, by the spring of 1941, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria, each for its own reasons, stood aligned with Nazi Germany. It was not a decision made in a single moment but the culmination of decades of territorial wounds, political instability, nationalist dreams, and growing dependence on a rapidly expanding German empire. None of them fully understood the catastrophe that lay ahead. The Balkans were now part of the storm. And the decisions these nations made, whether out of ambition, fear, or hope, would shape not only their wartime roles but also their future for generations to come. Hungary, the dream that turned into a trap. It was often said in Budapest during the early 1940s that history had finally begun to move in Hungary's favor, but beneath the surface of celebration there was always a quiet fear, the fear that the path they had chosen was far more dangerous than it appeared. Hungary entered World War II not with the enthusiasm of a conqueror but with the longing of a nation trying to reclaim its past. And yet, the deeper it stepped into the war, the more it became clear that the dream it chased was slowly turning into a trap woven by forces much larger than itself. The story of Hungary's wartime journey truly began the moment Europe realized that Germany had become the new master of the continent. The rapid fall of France and the collapse of many European democracies created a political vacuum in which smaller nations were forced to choose between appeasement, resistance, or alignment. For Hungary, whose national identity had been shaped by the trauma of lost territory, the rise of Nazi Germany seemed like an unexpected opportunity. But the opportunity came with strings attached, strings that tightened with each passing month. Hungary's leadership in the early 1940s was dominated by Regent Miklós Horthy, a figure who combined aristocratic pride with a sharp awareness of geopolitical realities. He disliked Hitler personally, distrusted Nazi ideology, and feared Germany's growing influence. Yet he also understood that Hungary, weakened by the treaties of the past and isolated by rivals on every border, could no longer rely on Western powers for support. Britain and France, once potential allies, were weakened and distant. The United States had not yet entered the war. Only Germany was willing to recognize Hungary's territorial claims, and that recognition became the anchor of Hungarian foreign policy. The first signs of change came through diplomatic channels. Germany began treating Hungary as a potential partner, inviting Hungarian officials to Berlin, offering military equipment, and encouraging the idea that Hungary could regain territories lost to Czechoslovakia and Romania. The turning point arrived after the Munich Agreement and the dismemberment of Czechoslovakia. Hungary received parts of southern Slovakia and Carpatho-Ruthenia not through its own power, but through German arbitration. It felt like a gift, but in truth it was a message: follow Germany, and your map will grow. This promise strengthened pro-German voices inside Hungary. Politicians and military officers began believing that the future lay in cooperation with Berlin. Newspapers published glowing articles about German strength. Schools taught students that Trianon would be overturned not by diplomacy but by aligning with the new order rising in Europe. Horthy himself remained cautious, but even he could not ignore the wave of public support for territorial revision. As Germany expanded, Hungary drifted closer to its orbit, sometimes willingly, sometimes reluctantly, but always with the hope that the dream of restoring the old kingdom might come true. By 1941, momentum became pressure. Germany was planning its invasion of Yugoslavia, and Hungary found itself in a delicate position. It wanted back parts of Vojvodina, a region that had once been under Hungarian rule, but it did not want to openly participate in the invasion. Hitler, however, expected cooperation. When Yugoslavia collapsed under the German assault, Hungary quickly occupied parts of the disintegrating country, claiming them as historically Hungarian lands. The population celebrated, streets filled with flags, and the government declared that national honor had been restored. But this celebration masked a dangerous truth: Hungary was no longer acting independently. It was moving in Germany's shadow. The real turning point the moment Hungary stepped fully into the war came with the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Initially, Horthy and his ministers tried to stay out of the conflict. They feared that fighting the Soviets would entangle Hungary in a war it could not win. But when a Hungarian city near the border was mysteriously bombed, an incident historians still debate, Hungary used it as justification to join the attack on the USSR. Some believed it was a German provocation, while others thought Hungarian officers acted on their own. Whatever the truth, the result was the same: Hungary declared war on the Soviet Union and crossed a line from which it could no longer return. Hungarian troops marched east with optimism, convinced that the Soviet Union would collapse quickly under the German assault. In the early months, the advance seemed unstoppable. Cities fell, villages burned, and prisoners marched westward in endless lines. But the further Hungarian soldiers moved into the vast open landscapes of Ukraine and Russia, the more they discovered a reality far harsher than the propaganda had promised. They encountered relentless Soviet resistance, brutal winters, and long supply lines that stretched far beyond what Hungary's modest military system could sustain. The worst moment came in 1943 at the Battle of the Don River, where Hungary's Second Army, sent to support German operations, was virtually destroyed. Tens of thousands of Hungarian soldiers froze, starved, or were killed by Soviet counterattacks. It was a catastrophe unlike anything the nation had experienced since World War I. Letters from the front carried stories of despair, broken morale, and commanders who felt abandoned by their German allies. Mothers waited at train stations for sons who would never return. The dream of territorial glory had led Hungary into a nightmare. As the war turned against Germany, Hungary tried to escape the alliance it had once embraced. Horthy secretly contacted the Western Allies, hoping to switch sides before the Soviets reached Budapest. But Germany discovered the plot. In March 1944, German forces occupied Hungary in a swift and bloodless takeover. Horthy's government became a puppet administration under German control. From that moment, Hungary's fate no longer rested in its own hands. The occupation unleashed another dark chapter. The Nazis demanded the deportation of Hungarian Jews, and under pressure, the collaborationist government cooperated. Within months, hundreds of thousands were deported to concentration camps. It was one of the fastest and most devastating deportations of the entire Holocaust. The nation that had sought territorial redemption now found itself complicit in one of history's greatest crimes, all because it had tied its future to Hitler's empire. In late 1944, as Soviet troops approached, Hungary descended into chaos. The Arrow cross-party radical fascist group seized control, unleashing terror in the capital. Battles raged across the countryside. Cities were destroyed, and civilians fled in all directions. When the Soviets finally captured Budapest in early 1945 after a brutal siege, the war was effectively over for Hungary. But the price of its wartime choices was monumental. The territories it had gained were lost again. The country fell under Soviet occupation. And the dream of restoring the old kingdom died with the collapse of Nazi Germany. Hungary had entered the war seeking redemption. Instead, it found devastation, betrayal, and a new occupation that would shape its future for decades. What began as a political gamble ended as a national tragedy, a stark reminder that dreams built on foreign promises rarely survive the storms of history. Romania, oil, ambition, and the sudden turn of war. The story of Romania in the Second World War unfolds like a shifting landscape, one moment solid, the next collapsing under the weight of forces it cannot control. It begins with a country standing on a foundation of oil-rich soil, valuable enough to attract the gaze of every major power, yet fragile enough to crumble at the slightest geopolitical tremor. By the early 1940s, Romania was caught in the tightening jaws of two giants, Nazi Germany on one side and the Soviet Union on the other. What followed was not a simple alliance or betrayal, but a desperate struggle for survival that would push the country into the heart of the conflict and later force it to make one of the most dramatic reversals of the entire war. Romania entered the era with deep political instability simmering beneath its surface. King Carol II, whose reign began with promises of modernization, had squandered public trust through corruption, repression, and erratic policy making. Far-right movements, especially the Iron Guard, gained influence by tapping into public resentment and promoting an intense nationalism. Yet even as internal conflicts brewed, the true danger lay beyond Romania's borders. The Soviet Union had never fully accepted losing Bessarabia years earlier, and tension between Bucharest and Moscow hovered like a storm cloud waiting for the right moment. That moment came in 1940. The Soviet Union, emboldened by its pact with Germany, delivered an ultimatum demanding Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. Romania was in no position to resist. With no meaningful support from Western powers and no chance of military success, the Romanian government was forced to retreat, allowing Soviet troops to occupy the territories without a fight. It was a national humiliation broadcast across the world. Crowds filled the streets in grief and anger, soldiers withdrew bitterly, and the population began questioning the very survival of the state. This loss was only the beginning. Within months, Romania was compelled to hand over northern Transylvania to Hungary through German-Italian arbitration, and southern Dobruja to Bulgaria. The territorial collapse shattered whatever authority King Carol II still held. Under immense pressure, he abdicated, leaving his son Michael as king and handing real power to General Ion Antonescu, a stern military figure who believed Romania's only chance for recovery lay in aligning with the strongest power in Europe, Nazi Germany. Antonescu's rise marked a profound shift in Romanian politics. He crushed his domestic rivals, including the Iron Guard after a violent struggle, and established himself as the leader of what he called the National Legionary State. His rule was authoritarian, uncompromising, and deeply influenced by a belief that Romania needed German friendship to avoid complete disintegration. Germany, too, had every reason to cultivate Romania's allegiance. The country's oil fields at Ploiești were among the most important in Europe, fuel that Germany desperately needed for its military machine. And so, the two nations entered a mutually dependent relationship, each relying on the other for survival in a world where neutrality was no longer an option. When Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, Romania joined the attack almost immediately. Antonescu framed the campaign as a mission to reclaim the territories the Soviets had taken, calling it a holy war for national restoration. Romanian troops marched across the Prut River with flags held high, believing they were fighting for justice. At first, their advance was swift. Town after town fell, and Romanian forces regained Bessarabia and northern Bucovina. The recapture was greeted with celebrations, gratitude, and a sense of triumph that momentarily erased the trauma of the previous year. But victory led to ambition. Encouraged by early success and eager to prove Romania's loyalty to Germany, Antonescu pushed his army deeper into Soviet territory, far beyond the recovered regions. Romanian soldiers soon found themselves fighting in the vastness of Ukraine, a land unfamiliar and unforgiving. While Germany provided some support, the burden of holding long front lines fell heavily on Romanian divisions, which were less equipped and poorly supplied compared to their German counterparts. Still, Antonescu insisted that Romania had a duty to fight until the Soviet Union was defeated, imagining that a seat at Hitler's diplomatic table would eventually secure Romania's desired borders. The cost of this loyalty became tragically clear at Stalingrad. Romanian armies were positioned on the flanks of the German Sixth Army, guarding sectors that were wide, exposed, and ill-equipped for major defense. When the Soviets launched their massive counter-offensive in late 1942, the Romanian lines collapsed under the weight of overwhelming force. Tens of thousands of Romanian soldiers were killed, captured, or simply disappeared in the snow-covered plains. News of the disaster spread quickly back home, igniting disbelief and quiet fury. Families mourned without bodies to bury. Villages received letters from the front that told of frozen nights, broken morale, and officers unable to protect their men. As Germany began to retreat, Romania discovered that it was tied to a sinking ship. Antonescu continued to believe in Hitler's assurances, even as German power visibly weakened. But Romania was changing. Its political class whispered in private that the alliance had gone too far, that the future required escape, not loyalty. Even King Michael, who had been largely ceremonial, began speaking discreetly with political leaders about ending the war. By 1944, Soviet troops were approaching the Romanian border again, and the nation once more faced the nightmare of invasion. The decisive moment arrived on August 23, 1944. In a dramatic move that stunned the world, King Michael ordered the arrest of Antonescu and announced Romania's withdrawal from the Axis. Within hours, Romania declared a ceasefire with the Allies and prepared to fight against Germany. It was a breathtaking reversal. A country that had been one of Germany's major partners now turned its guns on German forces occupying its soil. Streets erupted in both confusion and hope, as some Romanians cheered the prospect of liberation while others feared German retaliation. the switch came at a heavy price. German troops launched attacks on Romanian cities. Oil fields were sabotaged. Battles raged across the countryside as Romanian forces fought their former allies. But the Soviets advanced quickly, entering Bucharest and pushing German troops out. Romania was now officially part of the Allied side, yet its fate was no longer its own to shape. The Soviets treated Romania not as a liberated nation but as territory to be controlled. A new era of occupation began, one that would reshape the country's political system, economy, and society for decades. When the war finally ended, Romania was left with a complicated legacy. It had begun the conflict trying to preserve its borders, then fought alongside Germany for several brutal years, and ultimately switched sides in a desperate attempt to avoid destruction. The choices were rarely made from a position of strength. Instead, they reflected the impossible pressures faced by a country caught between rival empires, valuable enough to be fought over yet too vulnerable to stand alone. Romania emerged battered, transformed, and forever marked by the war's shifting alliances, a nation that had tried to survive the storm by changing direction at the last possible moment. Bulgaria, a quiet balancing act in a loud war. In the years leading into the Second World War, Bulgaria's position in Europe resembled a tightrope stretched between conflicting giants, with every step requiring precise calculation. It was a country guided less by ambition than by caution, shaped by the lingering pain of earlier losses and determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past. While other nations in the region plunged headlong into the conflict seeking glory or revenge, Bulgaria moved with unusual restraint, attempting to navigate the chaos without provoking the wrath of either Germany or the Soviet Union. Yet even a careful country can be swept into a storm it tries to avoid, and Bulgaria's journey through the war became a story of subtle diplomacy, uneasy alliances, and choices made in the shadow of far more powerful states. To understand Bulgaria's wartime path, one must first understand its emotional landscape after the First World War. The country had emerged from that earlier conflict with deep wounds, territorial losses that cut off its access to the Aegean Sea and shifted borders in ways many Bulgarians believed were unfair. The Treaty of WWII left a lasting bitterness, especially because the regions taken from Bulgaria were places where families had lived for generations. The sense of injustice simmered quietly, shaping politics and public sentiment. Yet unlike some of its neighbors, Bulgaria did not rush toward militarism or radical ideology in the 1930s. Instead, it tried to rebuild its economy, strengthen its monarchy, and maintain a careful distance from the rising tensions sweeping across Europe. That restraint, however, did not mean Bulgaria was unaware of what was happening. The rise of Nazi Germany was impossible to ignore. German influence grew rapidly, especially in the Balkans, where Berlin saw opportunities to secure allies and access resources. But Bulgaria approached Germany with far more caution than others. Its leaders admired German strength but worried about the cost of becoming too closely tied to Hitler's ambitions. At the same time, Bulgaria did not want to antagonize the Soviet Union, with whom it shared cultural and historical ties. The result was a foreign policy aimed at avoiding commitments for as long as possible, a strategy that required patience and a keen sense of timing. As war erupted in 1939, Bulgaria declared neutrality. This neutrality, however, was only partly under its control. Germany began pressuring the nation to cooperate, offering hints of territorial restoration if Bulgaria joined the Axis. The promises were tempting, especially regarding Macedonia and Thrace, but the Bulgarian government hesitated. King Boris III, a thoughtful and skeptical ruler, believed that plunging into war too early would expose Bulgaria to catastrophes it could not recover from. He understood his country's geographic vulnerability. Bulgaria lay along routes Germany needed to invade Greece and Yugoslavia, and it bordered territories under Soviet influence. A misstep in either direction could bring devastation. This delicate balance continued until early 1941, when Germany demanded passage through Bulgaria to prepare for its campaign in the Balkans. The pressure was undeniable. German divisions were massing near the Danube, and refusal could lead to occupation. King Boris and his ministers considered their options. Accepting German demands risked the anger of the Allies and the Soviet Union, but resisting risked invasion. Ultimately, Bulgaria agreed, allowing German troops to cross its territory. Shortly after, under increasing diplomatic pressure, Bulgaria formally joined the Axis, though the decision lacked the enthusiasm seen in other nations. For Bulgaria, it was a strategic necessity, not a declaration of ideological friendship. What followed seemed to validate the government's cautious approach. Germany quickly overwhelmed Yugoslavia and Greece, and in the aftermath, Bulgaria was rewarded with territories it had long sought. Parts of Macedonia and Thrace were placed under Bulgarian administration, and the population greeted the arrival of Bulgarian officials as a homecoming. Streets in those regions saw celebrations, flags, and parades, a stark contrast to the grim images of occupation elsewhere in Europe. Bulgaria's leaders viewed the moment as a national correction rather than a conquest, and for a time, the country believed it had successfully navigated the early war years without bloodshed. Yet beneath this calm surface, Bulgaria walked an increasingly narrow path. One of the most striking decisions it made during the war was its refusal to send troops against the Soviet Union. When Germany urged Bulgaria to join the invasion of the USSR, King Boris declined, insisting that Bulgaria had no quarrel with the Soviets. It was an unusually bold stance in a region where countries often followed Berlin's orders without question. This refusal set Bulgaria apart, positioning it as a unique Axis member, one that cooperated when necessary but quietly resisted when demands crossed a moral or strategic line. The decision helped preserve Bulgaria from the worst brutality of the Eastern Front, but it also heightened German suspicion and frustration. Domestically, Bulgaria faced its own moral challenges. Under German pressure, anti-Jewish laws were introduced, severely restricting the rights of Jewish citizens. These policies were deeply unpopular among many Bulgarians, including influential politicians and church leaders, who saw them as unjust and contrary to national values. When Germany later demanded the deportation of Bulgaria's Jewish population, opposition surged. In a rare and deeply significant act of defiance, Bulgarian leaders, clergy, and citizens collectively resisted the deportations, and the government ultimately refused to hand over its Jewish community. It was a courageous move that distinguished Bulgaria from nations that cooperated more fully with Nazi policies. Still, this defiance could only go so far. Jews living in territories administered by Bulgaria but not traditionally part of it were not protected in the same way, revealing the limits of moral resistance in wartime. As the war progressed and Germany began losing ground, Bulgaria found itself again approaching a crossroads. Soviet forces were advancing through Eastern Europe, and each German retreat shifted the balance of power further away from Berlin. Bulgarian leaders faced a familiar fear, the possibility of Soviet invasion, but also a familiar dilemma: remain loyal to a weakening Germany or attempt a risky shift toward the Allied side. King Boris had died suddenly in 1943 under mysterious circumstances, leaving a political vacuum that made decision-making even more precarious. His young son, Simeon II, inherited the throne, but real power rested in the hands of regents and politicians who disagreed on how to proceed. By 1944, the Soviet Union was no longer a distant threat but a rapidly approaching force. German power had dwindled, and Romania's dramatic defection to the Allies had changed regional dynamics. With Soviet troops nearing its borders, Bulgaria attempted to distance itself from Germany, hoping to demonstrate goodwill to the advancing army. It declared neutrality once more, dismissed pro-German officials, and signaled a willingness to negotiate with the Allies. But the shift came too late. In September 1944, Soviet forces entered Bulgarian territory without resistance. The government collapsed almost immediately, replaced by a new administration aligned with Moscow. Within days, Bulgaria declared war on Germany, transforming overnight from a reluctant Axis member into an Allied participant. The final months of the war were chaotic but brief for Bulgaria. Its troops fought alongside Soviet forces against Germany in Yugoslavia and Hungary, attempting to prove loyalty in the hope of securing better treatment in post-war negotiations. But the geopolitical reality was now beyond Bulgaria's control. The Soviet presence solidified, ushering in a new era of communist rule that would reshape the nation's political and social life for decades. When the conflict ended, Bulgaria emerged with a complicated legacy. It had avoided the devastation seen in neighboring countries, but it had also been swept into an ideological transformation it had not chosen. Its attempts at caution, diplomacy, and selective cooperation had kept it afloat for much of the war, yet they could not shield it from the consequences of living between powerful rivals. Bulgaria's wartime journey was one of subtle choices made in the shadow of louder, more forceful actors, a testament to the challenges faced by small nations trying to survive in a world defined by giants.